is what we're looking at here. And so, but we're introduced here to this thought in verse 17 of chapter 2 that he is a merciful and faithful high priest. And so that's what we're moving into, and obviously that's what Jake wanted me to touch on, is the faithful high priest. We talk a little bit about propitiation for sins. What is propitiation? What's the definition of that? Doug, you have a definition, I bet. That's right. I wrote down here, it's a gaining or regaining the favor or goodwill of someone or something. And so it's kind of almost a restoration. And he is one who shares in our sufferings. So moving on into chapter 3, we have a call here to consider Jesus as our high priest. And so we've talked about the superiority to angels, and so now we're continuing to build on that. As I said earlier, we're moving closer to the main thrust of Hebrews, and of course we're not going to get there tonight, but we're building this, or the author is building this case for Jews, Hellenistic Jews, and that Jesus Christ provides the ultimate redemption and fulfillment of the Old Testament promises, prophecies, the plan. And so we start with, he's superior to angels, right? But now we're going to move into this other phase. And could I get someone to read for us? And we're going to spend a lot of time here. This is where we're going to spend most of the time, and we may touch on a few other things in some of these other sections, but we're going to spend most of this time in Hebrews 3, verses 1 through 6. Could I get someone to read the first two verses of Hebrews 3?
Therefore, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling, consider the apostle, high priest of our confession, Christ Jesus, who was faithful to him, who appointed him, as Moses also was faithful in all his house.
Okay. We see that first introduction of the faithful high priest that is actually called the faithful, calling Jesus faithful there. What's one of the first things that jumps out to us in Hebrews 3, verse 1? Who is the author addressing? Right. That's right. That's right. And we'll get to that point in a second. But look at the second and third words. In my translation, it would be the second and third words of the whole chapter. It says, therefore, holy brethren. What does that mean? They're addressed as holy brethren, right? That means they're holy. All right, so we need to think about this from the perspective of the audience that this was intended for. So what does that mean? What does holy mean to the Jews? That's right. That's right. So where do we see, coming from that Old Testament, Old Covenant perspective, where do we see so much of this idea of consecration and for holiness? What book? Leviticus? Leviticus. And so if you go back to Leviticus, it goes into a lot of detail about what? All the things it takes to be consecrated. What's kind of chief among those things? Sacrifice, right? And so I jotted a note here. It says that Leviticus goes into much detail about sacrifice and purification because it was the only way that holiness could come about. So think about that. What does that mean? Did you have something? Go ahead.
Well, I think there's, at least to me, this is interesting. Maybe it's not anybody else, but at other times, and I don't know if Paul wrote this or not, that's beside the point right now. But you think specifically about the Apostle Paul.
Right.
At times just to Jews in general, he calls them brothers.
Mm-hmm.
Because just if nothing else in their ethnicity,
Mm-hmm.
they're brothers.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a little bit different. It's not just brothers, it's
Holy brothers.
brothers.
That's right.
Indicating that, this is Christian brothers, so it's not my brothers in Jewish faith.
It's different.
It's not holy brothers, it's a totally different
That's exactly right.
terminology. They're not holy brothers, brothers in Christ.
That's right. So,
And it's especially interesting in the fact that, for the Jews, their highest human authority was the high priest,
right,
and ours isn't.
right,
So, you've got a tugging match there.
Right.
Off the bat.
something that was interesting to me as you go through that, and you think about Leviticus, and you think about all of the steps that it had to go through for purification, all the sacrifices. It was it was the priests that were doing that, right? This was not something that could be that a person could attain on their own, right? Well, it's still not. Holiness is not something that we can attain on our own. It just like it took sacrifice then, it takes sacrifice now. It takes the one sacrifice once for all. So it was not something that we could that could be attained by merit. Does that make sense? Does it make sense what I'm saying? And so when the author addresses the holy brethren, it's not a recognition. It's not a congratulations. You got it. You made it. It's a recognition that there was a sacrifice that was made to get you there. Does that? Yes, sir.
One thing we need to keep in mind was when was the new covenant coming into effect? When did that happen? It happened with the price that Jesus paid on the cross. The cross was our reminder.
That's right.
He's talking here to these people about Christ
Mhm.
being here before he went to the cross.
Yep.
Before he went to the cross, they were still under the law.
That's right. And
And if we remember that, as we read this really makes good sense.
yeah, that's right. So we're talking here about that holy brethren. The wording there means something. It's not just kind of like Matt pointed out, it's not just a flippant statement. Holy brethren means something. And the fact that we're saying brethren means that we're also calling for something else. And what is that? When we're brethren, when we're together, we're what? We're one. We're unified. And so he's talking here, the author is saying, therefore, holy brethren, meaning holy, you've been made holy, and you are a unified body. Right? Who are we talking to? Us. We're talking to the church. Right? And we'll see that more as we go on. So the next thing it says partakers of a heavenly calling. What does that mean? Again, like we said. What? I'm sorry.
I don't know if that's right. I'm just talking out loud. Back out of that. A heavenly calling, I assume that means spreading the gospel.
Yeah. But obviously, where did the calling come from?
From Jesus himself.
From God, from Jesus? I mean, yes. I mean, so the fact that we're talking about a heavenly calling here says, and I just jotted this down, it points to the role that God played in this plan, okay, in saving the church. We didn't transform ourselves, right? This was, He transformed us into His people. So, therefore, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling. All right, so we became holy brethren. We became holy, unified, because it was a heavenly calling involved. Points to the role of God in that. So, and then the next thing here is and it's kind of what Rick had mentioned to us earlier. We're not, I hate to say commanded, but we're kind of forced to look at Christ as kind of in a dual role. It says at the end of verse 1, the apostle and high priest of our confession. Besides the fact that that's the only time that Christ is called an apostle, what else is different about that?
Apostle in this particular thing is one who is sent of God.
Right?
So,
And what does a high priest do? They intercede. They work the other direction. Right? So an apostle is sent, and a high priest sends, not sins, but send with a D. It's that East Texas. I can't get that D. But it's so you get that whole thrust of it in one person. Yes.
Should go back on use my calling or another word, my calling is invitation.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Makes it a little bit easier to think of what you say and share it. And definitely invitation.
Right. So when we talk about the apostle and high priest of our confession, the apostle is sent with authority, right? And then the high priest atones for sins and reconciles people to God. So we see this picture of Christ working in two directions, right? To deliver a message to us, and to intercede for us on the other hand.
to whom we should listen.
Right.
Yeah.
But two separate roles, both filled by Christ, and we're going to see that that's not the only thing that happens. Let's see. That's not. I guess I should say that's not the only role filled there. Continuing on into verse 2, it says, "He was faithful to him who appointed him, as Moses was in all his house." Now, so we're saying both were faithful. Both Moses and Christ were faithful in the roles that were laid out for them. But what does that? What's the significance of Moses? If I'm in this case, a Jew hearing this, he was a deliverer, but he was held in what kind of regard? Very high esteem. As a historical figure from the Old Testament, we know that tradition, it was held on to. Moses was held in very high esteem, and rightly so. But both were faithful in their roles. We see that comparison. The Jews held Moses in high regard, just as they did their other Old Testament historical figures. But God used Moses to deliver what? The law. Right? Was it not Moses that went up and received the commandments twice, 2 different times? But so that was Moses' role, and I'm not going to veer off onto some of these other references, but there is a reference here to Numbers 12 verses 6 through 8. And I guess we probably do need to flip over there. If somebody could flip over to Numbers 12, 6 through 8, and we'll kind of try to hit that pretty quick. Because this is not just this is not just a flippant reference. This is we're referencing something that's going to be familiar to That's exactly right.
establishing his connection with him.
That's right. He's building a case.
Building a case with what they know and believe and hold important.
That's exactly right. And we started with a lesser. We started with the angels, and then we're moving on to Moses. But if someone could read Numbers 12, verses 6 through 8 for us.
Then he said, Hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak to him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. I speak with him face to face, even plainly and not in dark sayings, and he sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?
So it's interesting here that that he's pointing to Moses as a servant, right? And so we think of the lowly servant, and in a way, yes, but he was held in very high regard too. And so here we are continuing to build this case because the point is that God had a relationship with Moses, but it pales in comparison to Christ. Okay? And so as great as Moses was, and as in whatever high regard, the call here is Christ is greater. Or the statement is Christ is greater. And so
See, the last part of that says, why were you afraid? Why weren't you afraid? So he's fixing to bring that into play.
that's right.
You already got the Christ. I mean,
That's right. And it says, in verse 8, it's very important there. He says, God spoke to Moses face to face. They were very close. I mean, this was a close relationship. It wasn't, anyway, that was the whole point of Hebrews, of Numbers 12. So let's talk about those levels of glory. Jesus is counted worthy of more glory than Moses based on this. And we should probably go ahead and pick up verse 3. It says, For he has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses by just so much as the builder of the house has more honor than the house. Let that sink in for a minute. What is that saying? The builder of the house. We've got an analogy going on here. And what are we saying? Who is the house? We are the house. But just as the builder of the house, but who is the builder of the house? And that's it. All right. And so, but Jesus was counted at the beginning of verse 3, for he has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses by just so much as the builder of the house has more honor than the house. Who built the house? Christ had a hand in building the house. God, and it goes on to say, and we'll see this in a minute, but that God is the builder of all things. We've seen that on billboards even around here. That's Jason Campbell's slogan. One of these verses out of Hebrews 3. But Moses, the analogy is Moses was a part of the house. He's a part of us, just because we know, and it was referenced earlier, but the crucifixion was a watershed moment because it marked the difference between two covenants. But what do we know about Christ's blood? It did what? Flowed two directions. So we'll see that again later on in Hebrews, how all of that was we're all joined together, and that's how we get to this point of Hebrews 11, where all of those of old were justified by their faith, same way we are, right?
I think there's no doubt that, Moses was a hero,
Mm-hmm.
and he drove them out of,
Mm-hmm.
the bondage that everybody, Christ, he got us away from sins, the slavery
Right.
of sin.
That's right.
And Moses could never,
Right.
accomplish that.
But as great as Moses was, he was counted as a servant.
Yeah.
He's got to move Christ above Moses.
That's right.
In their minds, he's got
And that's what this is, because if we look at our schedule here, we're talking about the faithful high priest, but next week will be the great high priest, and then it's gonna move on and continue to build that case, just like Hebrews does so well, of Christ's superiority, of the new covenant superiority. Okay, so the application for us is that glory belongs to Jesus as the builder.
As I look at this and read and study, I think in this part that Jesus, he never disobeyed the Father.
That's right.
He never committed a sin.
Tempted in all ways.
If you go back to Moses, why was Moses not allowed into the promised land? Because he had done what?
Disobeyed. Right. Yep.
Is there a difference between the two?
Very much so. That doesn't diminish Moses' greatness. It just means he's human. It just means he's like the rest of us. But that's a great point. Verse 4 says, "For every house is built," and this is the one that I said was on the billboards. "For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God." Right? Well, in the analogy that we saw, it was talking about Christ. Christ was the analogy of, was the parallel to the builder. So now what are we saying? What's being said to these Jews? Christ is God. Right? It was a subtle, not so subtle, hey, the one you've been looking for, the one that's been prophesied about, the one that this plan has been laid out. This is it. And I don't know if I'm going to have time to get to it because we're barely in it and we're almost done. But he had to put it that way.
For them to comprehend it.
There's a lot of what we would call Easter eggs being thrown in here that are very familiar to the Jews that were the audience of this.
you bring in what they already know.
That's right.
Blend it with what you're trying to teach them, and they can accept it.
Every house has a builder. God's the builder of all things, but Jesus is the builder of God's house. All that does is affirms what we know today, but what he was trying to get across, what the author was trying to get across here, is the deity of Christ. All right? And I guess the point I was going to make a second ago is that I can't remember what the point I was going to make a second ago. How do you like that? But it slipped right out of my mind. But it'll come back to me in a minute. Let's move on into verses 5 and 6. It says, "Now Moses was faithful in all his house as a servant for a testimony of those things which were to be spoken later. But Christ was faithful as a son over his house, whose house we are." So that's where it's just plainly stated, whose house we are, right? We are part of that house. We do help make up that house. If we hold fast our confidence and the boast of our hope firm until the end. So what do we see here in verses 5 and 6? Talking about back to this theme of faithfulness, faithfulness in God's house. Moses was faithful as a servant. He testified to things that were spoken later on in Deuteronomy. But Christ was faithful over God's house as a son, and he holds that superior position. He's an heir, he's a ruler, he has authority over that house, okay? As all of those things. So, as great as Moses was, Jesus was greater. Just as the builder of the house is greater than the house. We don't celebrate the beautiful sculpture, we celebrate the sculptor, right? we don't celebrate the painting, we celebrate the painter. They hold the fame, right? And so that was kind of the point that's being made here. Now, something that we need to remember, and it's pointed out right there, toward the end of verse 6. It says there's a condition. It says, but Christ was faithful as a son over his house, whose house we are, if we hold fast our confidence and the boast of our hope firm until the end. Faith. Continued faithfulness, holding fast confidence, holding fast to the confidence and hope. So that's the condition that we face of belonging to God's house. Yes, sir.
I'm starting to get the idea that God may value faithfulness.
Maybe so, and we'll see that again. Like I say, I mean, anybody who knows me knows my affinity for Hebrews 11. It's my favorite, because it brings things together so well. But that's where we see all of this united, because it was always about faith. It's always been about faith. So whether it was this side or that side of the cross, it was always about faith. Let's see. I was going to see if there were a couple of points that I could make. One of the things that one of the points I wanted to make, but we won't get there, and it's really kind of skipping ahead, and it's a spoiler alert here. But I was talking about that plan, the plan of salvation, and we look at these two covenants as two distinct, and they are. I mean, with a watershed, obviously, the biggest watershed moment in history, right in the middle of them. But that was always the plan, and it was always laid out, and the prophecies were always there. All we're saying here is, hey, that thing we've been talking about that was going to happen, all of that, here it is. This is the guy. This is the one. And then, but let's think about Christ and those roles. We talked about he was the apostle and he's the high priest. But what were the elements of sacrifice? If you had to say, we're going to include these things in a sacrifice, there had to be a sinner to be sacrificed for, right? There had to be sin, so therefore there had to be a sinner, there had to be a high priest, God had to be involved, and there had to be a sacrifice. Well, let's reflect on that. Where does Christ fit in there? He was all of that. You see? So he replaced the whole system. The whole program was replaced once for all. Let's see. So let's see if I can pick out a couple of things. Again, I want to make this point. I don't know that it was ever intended for there to be two separate. Yes, very distinct, but everything from the Old Testament pointed to these very events happening. Right? It was all one story. It wasn't two separate stories told. It was the continuation. That's all we're looking at is the continuation of the story of salvation. Okay? Does it make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, because it wasn't a sprint, it was a marathon.
That's right.
And it had to be, you had so much detail in there that it had to be done that way.
But everything had to happen in its due course, in its due time. But all of this was brought forward to bring us a Christ, and then Christ took over from here on. And that's the appeal here is, hey, let's move on with the story. the author is saying to these Jews, hey, it's time for phase 2. It's time for phase 2 of this plan. Because the old covenant, the Old Testament, the old law, it has served its purpose, and it's brought us to this point. Now we've got to pick up here and move forward. Just a couple of things in Hebrews 3:19, and 3:17 through 19. I'm sorry, 7, did I say 17 through 9? 7 through 19. There is a warning here to Israel about Israel's history, and it's an urgency to get on board with this next phase. That's what we're saying, because they're used as an example. It says, today, if you hear his voice, there's an urgency there, right? In verses 8 and 9, there's a warning against hardening the hearts, as Israel did, because we know how that worked out. I mean, they got out of Egypt, but they didn't get into the promised land. Many of them didn't. Meribah and Massa were referenced in that reference. It's not referenced there, but if you go back to what is that? Psalm 95. I'm sorry, not Psalm. That was back in Exodus, obviously. But that was the disobedience. It was the water, the crying out for water, and the rebellion and the testing and all of that. But there's a historical context there. Israel saw God's works for 40 years, but still tested him. Okay? That's the warning. Don't do like they did. Here it is. We're showing it to you, just like it was shown to the Israelites in the wilderness. They tested him. Don't y'all do it. Don't y'all test the same way, because you saw what happened to them. Don't be a party to that. Okay? That's the don't keep on doing what your people have historically done, which is, test God.
They believed that, too.
Mm-hmm.
They had no doubt that happened.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He's trying to show them you can do exactly the same thing right here.
He needed them to recognize that in themselves, right? And so in verses 10 and 11, Israel provoked God's anger. They consistently went astray and did not know His ways. But and so just a few points being made here. God swore they would not enter His rest due to their disobedience, and that's what He's saying again. Warning: don't do this. Don't meet that same fate. That was the plea, and it's a parallel warning to to the Jews of that time. Don't do that. Let's see. We're fixing to be done here.
We have a tendency today, a lot of people do, that God is love, He's not going to send anybody to hell.
Mhm.
He's not going to happen. I'm sure that in a lot of the wandering in the desert, they felt that they were included.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they would eventually come out of that on the other side. But that's the point of the rest of chapter 3 was don't do what they did. You've seen it. It's going to happen, or it can happen to you. It happened to them. He saved them only to let them wander, but that was their choice to wander, because they and he was just basically asking, please don't do the same thing, So anyway, I'm sorry that's as far as we got, but I hope you got a little something out of it. And don't worry, Jake will be back next week to clean up my mess. So thank y'all.